It'll get to responses, but first I want to talk a little bit more about the nature of the conflict. And this is about self-determination. It's about the right of the Ukrainian people to have their democracy and their own process of self-determination. So NATO has traditionally been an alliance based on values. And to what extent do you think what we're looking at is a conflict of values, where you have a sovereign country which is, you know, wants to self-determine, has its own process of democracy, and then you have this challenge from essentially an authoritarian state. Does that factor into the way you're viewing the conflict?
Well, it factors in at several levels, right? You brought up the question of self-determination. And this is all something we saw in the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, which is the right of self-determination from an imperial center. In one case, Yugoslavia, in the other case, the right of Ukraine from sovereignty from the Soviet Union. Then the question of the rights of people within boundaries to self-determination or not. This has been, again, part of the Russian Kremlin's justification for this is that the Ukrainian government is not allowing the rights of ethnic Russians to cultural and linguistic self-determination, and that this is supposed to provide that Russia has a right to protect. I think one of the things we may go back in the future is when we look back at the era of the early 2000s is, did we think through some of the doctrines we proclaimed as we've seen how Russia has used them, both with self-determination, right to protect, other things of that sort. But again, the question is that these are up to people of Ukraine to make these determinations. They do not have a dependent relationship on Russia. They are not part of Russia in the sense that Russia has some right or obligation to make judgment calls for Ukraine. The question about NATO that you bring in, again, I also would caution in that we've talked a lot in recent decades about NATO as an alliance of values, but really it got its start as a very coldly realist collective security organization to withstand the Soviet threat to Europe. And at the time NATO was created and throughout much of its Cold War history, not all of its members were democracies, or they were democracies more in name than in practice. And I'm thinking primarily of some of the southern members of NATO, Southern European members of NATO during this time. After the Cold War ended, I think we had this discourse of NATO as an alliance of democracies, but I think now we're having the question again of NATO as defending values or defending members. And this is why the question of Ukraine's membership in NATO has been contentious, not just for Russia, but for existing NATO members who then have to weigh the ethical dilemma, an ethical choice of, do we extend protection to Ukraine as a member of NATO on the basis of shared values, and therefore we take onto ourselves the burdens and the risks of potentially fighting a war. This is why the initial bid to try to bring Ukraine into NATO in 2008 at the Bucharest summit really foundered, because you had a number of states saying, we certainly sympathize with Ukraine, but we're not willing to make the commitment to treat an attack on Ukraine as an armed attack on us, and therefore to respond. And that has to do again with some ethical choices, which is who do you owe your primary ethical duties to? Do you owe it to a global community, humanity as a whole, or do you owe it to your specific nation state? And I think we've seen this we've seen this, by the way, also with some of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, which noticeably have exempted the energy trade, because certainly people are willing to impose costs on Russia, but there has been hesitation about assuming some of the costs domestically. And again, there are some who say that's not ethical, we should have imposed a full range of sanctions on Russia, but then you also have policymakers who say we have ethical duties to our own populations, and we're trying to balance our obligation to respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine with what we see as our ethical obligations to our own citizens.